John, tell us about did the House of Lords get it right? Is there work for us to do in the housing sector in terms of embracing a new model for construction?
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I will come back to the House of Lords report, but having listened to the other presentations in this session, I think it's probably worth just saying one or two words about how we would see the issues that have just been discussed. And I would certainly say that there's no intrinsic reason why home builders are not willing to embrace innovation. But listening to what Nigel's just said, unfortunately, too often the key consideration up front is the initial capital cost. So when you're talking about what the client is really wanting in terms of value, I think very often in the harsh competitive world of home building, when you're competing for sites to offer the landowner the best value for the land that you're hoping to buy, then you do have to look first and foremost at the initial capital cost, and the long-term sort of whole life costs aren't necessarily ones that translate through into that key commercial transaction in the mainstream private housing market. So that is a challenge. Interestingly, I was at a lunch earlier today where we were talking about these issues as well, and I think there's an increasing willingness in the part of home builders to embrace BIM, but there are also perceptions, they're quite big potential barriers for people to go into it. In the mainstream housing sector, we don't have the big public procurement goals that other aspects of civil construction do, infrastructure projects do. There is no big government procurement program that's saying that BIM would be used. So it's very much a business case of how it would be used and how the companies see it themselves. And although a number of the companies can see the potential benefits, there are also perceptions that it's really quite a big investment of time and effort, not necessarily money in the hard sense of money, for companies to adopt it, because people have to get familiar with the processes, they have to understand how it can be used, and I guess it comes back to the point the other speakers were making about what use do you make of the data. It's not just having the data itself, not just understanding what the information is, but how can you use it, how can you inform decision making. So there's actually quite a lot of investment that companies have to make in order to get to the point where they could really harness the benefits. So I do think that from a commercial home building point of view, you have to understand that context and the concerns that people have about embracing innovation to get the benefits out of it. And I just thought it may be useful to make those points. Coming back to the House of Lords, now I've got a bit of a challenge with this because I'm not sure whether any of you would have read the House of Lords report or not. It's actually the report by the House of Lords Select Committee on the National Policy for the Built Environment. Bit of a mouthful. It's a one-off Select Committee inquiry, which ran over several months and reported quite recently. And it would be really nice to say that they did get it right. Unfortunately, I fear they didn't. And actually, it wasn't for a lack of trying. They talked to an awful lot of people, including us. I personally gave evidence, and we had a really good session. I was probably talking to the Noble Lords for an hour and a half, an hour and 3/4 in the session that we had. We covered an enormous amount of ground, and it seemed quite an encouraging discussion. But when you read the report, I fear it is rather disappointing. And I don't think it really offers a blueprint that will crack the housing supply solution. So why do I say that? Why do I think it's a missed opportunity? I think in many ways it's because they went back to the future rather than taking a really brave look at what possible new solutions might be. And just to illustrate this briefly with picking up some of the key recommendations the House of Lords had and why I don't necessarily think they were the best way forward. It's not to say that everything in the report is stuff I disagree with, but I just feel overall it wasn't really hitting the mark. So they started by saying they welcome the government's focus on increasing and speeding up the supply of housing. Hard to disagree with that. We all agree with that. But that doesn't in itself get you that far. But then they went on to question the ability of the private sector to deliver the number of new homes required. And perhaps you wouldn't expect me to agree with that, and I don't. And I think, unfortunately, the committee really didn't look in enough depth at the reasons why the private sector has been effectively held back from delivering as much housing as it might have done over many years. And frankly, if you don't really understand that, then you're not going to come up with the right answers to the housing supply solution. They went on to talk about giving housing associations, local authorities, and others a bigger role in housing supply. And I've got absolutely no problem with that. I think the more players we have on the pitch, the better. But what they seem to ignore in saying that is a lot of the issues that hold back the private sector also in practice hold back housing associations and other potential entrants to the market. And over my lifetime of working at HBF, and I've been at HBF for over 10 years, we've certainly had repeated debates about bringing in new entrants. Maybe there'll be foreign companies that would come into the housing market in a big way. And by and large, it hasn't really happened. And in most cases, that's because those companies, when they've tried to come into the market, have found it's actually a really tough and difficult business environment, and they can't actually make it work in the way that they thought in principle they could, and then in many cases they've pulled out again and not developed a mass housing business, even though that was what their hope was. I mean, no problem if they do, but in practice it's proved difficult for businesses to do that. So the House of Lords didn't really address that set of issues and why we've had a long period of no major market entry into home building. They talked about other things, about gaps between planning permissions granted and new homes built. But again, their analysis was probably off the pace, and they seem to think that was primarily because home builders and others don't necessarily want to build out when they have planning permission. But that's the last thing that home builders don't want to do. Home builders, they got capital locked up in a development with planning permission. They want to get a return on it, so they do start building. There may be issues why they can't start building as quickly as they want to, tied up with regulatory controls, the speed of the planning system and so on. But as soon as they can build, they actually want to get on with it and get a return on their capital. So I'm afraid there are solutions there, including sort of taxing any parties that aren't building out quickly, are not necessarily helpful, probably discourage investment rather than encouraging it. They were concerned about government's emphasis on speed of build and quantity of build actually undermining quality and urban design and things like that. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. It's an understandable question to ask. But again, the committee's answer to this was really to go back to the future and reintroduce a whole lot of regulation and other measures, which are really control measures. And the more you have, in my view, the more you have control measures, the more you're likely to hinder construction rather than help it. And if we really want to ramp up production, the answer isn't to impose more regulatory controls, more hurdles. It's actually to find cleverer ways of doing things. And the committee really rather missed that in its ponderings. They also picked up on viability and seemed to think that viability assessments in the way they operate in local plans were almost deliberately frustrating public policy objectives. And seem to think that you really shouldn't worry too much about viability as an issue from the home building point of view. If you simply say that you want a public policy objective, then that should be sufficient and people will just find a way of delivering it. But the reality for commercial businesses is that if you don't have viability, you don't build. So that doesn't seem a very logical way to me of actually achieving your public policy objectives. There's a lot more, but I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through more points now in terms of what the report said, but just to sort of sum up, I hope I've given you a flavour as to why that type of public policy debate isn't necessarily the way forward. What we need is actually more radical solutions in a way, and it is a leap of faith in some respects. It is a brave thing to say for public policy makers. We need sort of fewer regulations, fewer controls, cleverer mechanisms for achieving public policy objectives, and actually improve the business environment. I just wanted to leave you with one fact that I think is absolutely stunning about the business environment for home building, which is that back in the 1980s, we had some 12,000 SME home builders building up to 100 units a year. As of today, we have less than 3,000. And that must tell you something about the business climate for small businesses and growing businesses. And since we had the trough of the recession back in 2009, 2010, the major builders have increased output by some 50%. But the SMEs, because the business environment is really difficult for them, no net increase in output whatsoever. So the committee completely failed, I'm afraid, to look at those kind of issues in a really penetrating way. And I think you've just got to do that if you're really going to crack the problem.
Thanks, John. John, just a quick question though, around the whole. We're talking about transforming house building. I suppose one of the key things, the reality around house building is that the big money's in the land. Is there really a business model for transforming the way that houses are built? Just simply because at the moment, the land price is the big issue. The big
well, I mean, the land price has been the big issue. In some areas, it still is. I think I would. I was listening to another debate down the corridor earlier on, where this point came up. Actually, the land situation is better than it was. The land situation is better because the National Planning Policy Framework has actually improved land supply. And in many areas, not in all areas, in many areas, land prices today are not quite as high as they were in the sort of pre-2007, 2008 period. So there has been some progress. But really the solution is freeing up land supply, because if land supply is abundant and there aren't barriers to it and you can get hold of land as quickly as you reasonably need to, then the price will necessarily be lower.
John, thanks so much for rounding off our fringe factor. I've got a question. Nigel, far away.
Hi. Just a quick question on new entrants and new ways of doing things. The indications are there's quite a lot of money in the economy looking for a home to be invested in, and there's a resurgence of interest in sort of institutional investment in the private rental market. And going back to my point on value for the client, the value for the client then becomes how quickly can they finish something in order to get rental income flows coming in, as opposed to building at a speed that they can sell at a market price they want to sell at. And so do you see there being an increase in speed of construction and more off-site housing construction
for those markets?
Those sorts of markets?
Yes, I think that's a perfectly fair comment. I mean, at the moment, where it's always been easiest for people to make off-site solutions work has been in areas where you have fairly clear certainty of a scale of demand over a given period. And so sort of institutional investment in dedicated private rental developments where you know you're going to sell a good number of units at a specified time works much better in that sense. It's always worked, student accommodation clearly works. It's worked in social housing, affordable housing to a greater extent than in the private retail market, largely for the same reason, because if a housing associations or local authority demands mean that there's a sort of guaranteed market for a certain amount of affordable housing over a particular period of time, you don't have the market sale risk that you have in the open market. And also in the open retail market, open market private sale customers, you don't know what the speed of delivery is. Builders have standard house types, but they flex them across different sites in different volumes at different sales rates. And if offsite can accommodate that in a cost-effective, really flexible way, then I think it will get bigger take-up. But in the past, that hasn't necessarily worked as well as the industry would need it to work. But I think things are changing. The current skills crisis on housing is going to be another driver towards people looking more at off-site. So I certainly don't despair of this happening. I think there are people having much more of a look at it now than they have done.
John, thanks very much for running off. Round of applause for John Slaughter, Mate BF. Thanks very much. Right.